Hey everybody, Kelton here again. Today we're going to be talking about carbohydrates, so pause the video, take a look at the outline, and we're going to get started. Carbohydrates are one of our main three macromolecules, in addition to lipids and proteins. If we break down the term carbohydrate, we see that it simply just means carbon and water. You've probably heard of carbohydrates being your sugars in your diet before, and this is exactly correct. We find three main classifications of carbohydrates, which are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. This saccharide term just means sugar. In addressing monosaccharides, take a moment and see if you can recall what mono means. And nice, so hopefully you remembered mono means one. So a monosaccharide just means one unit of sugar. All monosaccharides have the empirical formula of CH2O. If we take a look at these monosaccharides here on the right, notice that all of their molecular formulas can be simplified down to that empirical formula. Some of the more common monosaccharides are 5-carbon and 6-carbon sugars. A 5-carbon sugar, such as our ribose here, are known as pentose. From that, do you think you can guess what a 6-carbon sugar would be named? And nice, so hopefully you remembered hex means 6, so a 6-carbon sugar is known as a hexose. If we look at our two hexoses up here, what is going to be the relationship between glucose and fructose? Notice they have the same chemical formulas, but different structures. And perfect, so hopefully you were able to recall that structural isomers have the same molecular formula, but the arrangement of the atoms is different. Monosaccharides can either be in a linear form, as we see here on the left, or a ring form, as we see here on the right. Whenever this ring structure forms, we are going to form a new alcohol, or a new hydroxyl group, as we see here, and as we see here. So, this positioning of the hydroxyl group is really important because it's going to tell us the difference between an alpha and a beta sugar. When determining alpha versus beta on a ring structure, we want to first look at our new hydroxyl group that just formed and the CH2OH group. So notice in this image we have the CH2OH group on one side, and on the opposite side of the ring we have our newly formed hydroxyl group. This means that this is going to be an alpha sugar. On the other molecule, we see that we have our CH2OH group on the same side of the ring as that newly formed hydroxyl group. This makes this a beta sugar. The next class of sugars that we'll talk about are disaccharides. So remember, if we had a monosaccharide that meant 1 unit of sugar, a disaccharide must mean 2 units of sugar. A disaccharide is going to form as the result of 2 monosaccharides coming together. So if we look at this reaction below, we see on the right we have our newly formed disaccharide, and it's coming from these 2 monosaccharides merging together. So what type of reaction is this? And one thing that will give you a hint is, notice water is going to be a byproduct. And great, so hopefully you remembered this is a dehydration reaction because we're losing water and combining 2 things together. So this dehydration reaction is going to result in the formation of a glycosidic bond, as we see here. So a glycosidic bond is just going to be any time a carbohydrate makes a bond to something else. Water can also be added to a disaccharide, and it can break apart into 2 different monomers again, as we see in this reaction below. So what type of reaction is this going to be called? And perfect, so hopefully you remember that anytime we're adding in water to break apart a molecule, it's a hydrolysis reaction. A few common examples of disaccharides we see could be sucrose, as we see here. This is just going to be fructose and glucose added together. Lactose, and this is one that can make you sick if you're lactose intolerant, but this is just a galactose and a glucose together. And lastly, we have maltose, which is just 2 glucose stuck together. And now we're on to the last group, our polysaccharides. So polysaccharides means that we have many units of sugars bonded together. Polysaccharides come in a variety of different shapes and sizes, and we see some could be branched or unbranched. Some are used for storage, while others are used for structural support. Starch is a type of storage polysaccharide found within plant cells. There are 2 different forms, a branched form of starch and an unbranched form of starch. We can see both of those here. Do you think you could guess which one of these is the branched and which one is the unbranched form? And perfect, so hopefully you were able to see that amylose is going to be the linear form of starch. This contains only alpha-1,4 glycosidic linkages. Amylopectin then is the branched form of starch, and we see this has alpha-1,4 glycosidic linkages as well, but it also has alpha-1,6 glycosidic linkages, which are the red dots here, and we can see this is where the branching is actually occurring. Another really common storage polysaccharide is known as glycogen. Take a second and try to recall from anatomy and physiology where you might have heard of this term before. And great, so hopefully you remembered that glycogen is going to be made up of by glucose monomers, and this is how humans store glucose long term. Similarly to amylopectin, glycogen has alpha-1,4 and alpha-1,6 glycosidic bonds. The difference though is glycogen is much more branched than amylopectin. Do you remember which organs are associated with glycogen storage? And perfect. So glycogen is found stored within the liver and our muscle cells. The next polysaccharide we will discuss is cellulose. Where have you heard of this term before? And nice, hopefully you recalled that cellulose is a polysaccharide that's found within the cell walls of plants and is used for structural support. Cellulose contains beta-1,4 glycosidic bonds. These beta-1,4 glycosidic bonds makes it so cellulose lines up in parallel like this. Because of this orientation, cellulose is going to have strong intermolecular forces between themselves, and we see this happen here. What do you think these forces might be? And perfect. In answering this question, hopefully you remembered that cellulose is comprised of by glucose monomers. Remember, glucose has a lot of hydroxyl groups on it, and these hydroxyl groups are capable of doing hydrogen bonding between themselves. This parallel structure, along with the extra intermolecular forces, makes it so cellulose is a really great polysaccharide for structural support. So, can we digest these beta-1,4 glycosidic linkages on cellulose? And great, so hopefully you cued in on this little clue here. Cellulose is just fiber, and we are unable to digest fiber, although it is still an important part of our diets. The last polysaccharide we will discuss today is chitin. So remember, chitin is just going to be something that's found within the cell wall of fungi or the exoskeletons of insects. Similarly to cellulose, chitin contains beta-1,4 glycosidic bonds. These make it so chitin is also going to have a similar parallel arrangement. The key difference between cellulose and chitin can be seen right here. So, cellulose has a bunch of hydroxyl groups. In chitin, one of those hydroxyl groups is swapped for a nitrogen-containing functional group. This means that instead of being a polymer of glucose like cellulose is, chitin is a polymer of N-acetylglucosamine. Okay, so we've made it to the end of the lesson, so now it's time for a mini quiz. So, which of the following molecules is a monosaccharide? When looking at answer A, sucrose is a disaccharide because remember, it's made up of two monosaccharides, which were glucose and fructose, so we can get rid of that one. B is a little bit more tricky because we might not remember the name of the sugar associated with this molecular formula. But remember, we do know the empirical formula of a monosaccharide is CH2O. And if we divide each of these numbers by 5, we end up simplifying this to CH2O. So this is a possible answer. Looking at C next then, remember this is the storage polysaccharide found in humans, so we can get rid of this one. Answer choice D is a little bit more difficult at the start because it's another formula, but remember, all monosaccharides contain within 3 to 7 carbons, so we can get rid of this one as well. This leaves us with B being our correct answer, and if you remember from earlier, ribose had this molecular formula. So now that we've had the lesson and a quiz, let's do a quick review to see what you learned today. What type of reaction forms a disaccharide from two monosaccharides? What type of linkage occurs when a carbohydrate bonds to something else? And lastly, what are structural polysaccharides and how do they differ from storage polysaccharides? If you can answer these questions, you're well on your way to success. Everybody be sure to have a great day.